And now to the sort of headline show here. I feel like when we were promoting this event and asking, I feel like I was promoting Taylor Swift. The sort of subscription to this event was more than any supply that we can have, and it's a testament to the man that we're honoring today. And as I look throughout the room today, I see everybody with a name tag on except one person, and so I don't feel like I need to go through a biography here. But just to say that Dr. Walsh has changed many lives, from patients, from all of our patients, from the patients of our trainees. But he's for sure changed my life. And I remember as a medical student walking into his clinic, being a little bit interested in urology and being inspired by Brady residents working with Dr. Cavusi, Jeff Kadedu, Steve Jackman, Peter Shulam, and others. And that day really, for me, changed the entire world. And one of the biggest honors in my life has been working with you, Dr. Walsh. So thank you. Matching at the Brady and the story that followed, and now sharing patients has also been another great honor. And I have to admit that I still go to your note and try to read the answer in the back of the book before I talk to the patient, because you always have some really good nuggets that even after doing 3,600 or so prostatectomies, I still learn from you every day. And I know when I talk to your patients, they think the world of you. Many of them are here today. And it's not one or two, but there are thousands out there, and their families, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, all, I'm sure, feel the same way that I do and more. So we're very grateful to have had you in our life, and we're looking forward to this wonderful talk and wonderful event tonight. So Dr. Walsh is going to talk to us about, if you don't know where you're going, how will you ever get there? Thank you, Dr. Walsh.
Oh, Mo, what wonderful comments. Well, for Peg and me, if this is overwhelming to see so many of you, and imagine so many friends over 50 years, I almost feel like I hope I'll make it to heaven, and looking down and seeing my eulogy. And I thank you for coming. Okay, what does this title mean? Well, I felt I had a responsibility to explain how I ended up where I am today. And I had to ask myself how I got here and how I knew where I was going. And that's what prompted this. And it was this figure I saw, the crowd going one direction and one person taking the road less traveled. So how did that person know to go there? And I'm going to pause for a second and say, Alyssa and her team and Mo are fantastic. And when I opened up the program and I saw this quote in here of Einstein, I thought, this tells an awful lot. Einstein said those who follow the crowd will likely get no further than the crowd. But those who walk alone often end up in places no one has ever seen before. So how does that happen? There's a sign, there's an arrow. Someone tells them where to go. That's how I got here, and that's the story I'm going to tell. The problem is that there are so many people in this crowd I can't mention personally, but you know who you are, and you influenced me, and I know who you are. And very personally, I want to thank all of you who I will not be able to include in my 7-hour talk. It's 50 minutes, I'm sorry. So here we go, 50 minutes, 50 years. Disclosures. I love to quote Winston Churchill. And one of my favorite quotes was about his political opponent, Attlee. Attlee is a modest man and has much to be modest about. Disclosure. Patrick Walsh also has much to be modest about. But today, because I will speak about how others helped me to be successful, I will not have the time to tell you about all the mistakes I made on my own. My parents and early influences. When beloved dean, Hopkins Medical School Dean Tommy Turner, lived to be 100 years old, and people asked how he did it. He said he did a very good job in picking his parents. God did a very good job in picking mine. I was born on February 13th, 1938 in Akron, Ohio, into a deeply religious family with modest resources, which they used selflessly to rear their 4 children. They sent me to be trained by Dominican nuns from the age of 3 to 18. And in school, each day, we were reminded why we were on this earth: to know, love, and serve God, and to use the gifts that we were given to share with others, to literally give them away. Well, from the time I was very young, I wanted to be a doctor, and this advice made sense. It was also reinforced by the way my parents lived their lives. As life went on, I had friends and colleagues who had a more elite education, were smarter, more talented, worked just as hard, but some of them eventually failed to live up to their potential to make a contribution. However, because of these formative influences, I never seemed to lose my compass, and wherever I encountered a difficulty, I just asked the Lord for help. And in the beginning of this talk, you will see a number of different statements underlined in bold, and I will return to them later on, and this statement may be the most important. Education. From 1956 to 1960, I went to Case Western Reserve for my undergraduate school education, and then on there to medical school from 1960 to 64. The school was pioneering a system approach to medical education, which emphasized the integration of basic disciplines like anatomy, physiology, and by repeating them again and again during the first year as we learned the normal systems, cardiovascular system, cardiovascular respiratory, nervous system, etc. And then during the next year and a half, when learning the pathophysiology, organ system by organ system. For this reason, I spent 2.5 years learning anatomy and performing cadaveric dissections. In most medical schools, it's only 2 months. A few weeks after entering medical school, each student was assigned a woman who was pregnant, and we attended her delivery, and we became that baby's doctor for the next 4 years. Benjamin Spock, the famous pediatrician and author of Baby and Child Care, which sold 50 million copies, was my preceptor during all of those years. I was inspired by his compassionate patient care and by the importance of writing a book for lay people. We were required to write a thesis, so for 3 years I worked in the laboratory of Claude Beck, a famous cardiac surgeon, who was the first individual to successfully defibrillate a human heart. And I wrote my thesis on closed chest cardiopulmonary resuscitation. On our last visit, he gave me some important advice. He said, "Pat, listen to your patients." And he told me this story in 1920 when he was graduating from Hopkins Medical School. He had a patient who told him that her anemia was cured by eating raw liver. He said, "If I had listened to her, I may have received the Nobel Prize rather than George Whipple." But my most important discovery was made during my freshman year at an exhibit on campus where I saw this painting, 4 and 20 Blackbirds. When I looked at the name of the artist, I recognized it. Margaret Peg Campbell, a beautiful, talented student who was a senior in the School of Art and Architecture studying interior design. Fortunately, my roommate was dating her best friend, Anne, which facilitated our first date on Anne's birthday, March 3rd, 1961. Well, Peg was in her senior year and was being offered attractive positions in other cities. But fortunately for me, she took a position with an interior design firm in Shaker Heights, which is a suburb of Cleveland. And in May 1964, at the time of graduation from medical school, we married and went off to Boston. We just celebrated our 60th wedding anniversary. As you will see, Peg has been the most important influence in my life. The Peterman Brigham Hospital. I selected the Brigham because the initial training consisted of 2 years of adult surgery and a year of pediatric surgery at Boston Children's Hospital. Also, it was a center of excellence. In 1962, Joseph Murray, the future Nobel Prize winner for transplantation, performed the world's first successful cadaveric kidney transplant. We became lifelong friends. In 1963, the chair of surgery, Francis Moore, had his photograph on the cover of Time magazine. Well, after finishing my internship in 1965, at the age of 27, I went to see Dr. Moore for advice about where I should train in urology. And what he said stunned me. I suggest you train with Willard Goodwin at UCLA, spend a couple of years doing research at a center of excellence, and return here to succeed Dr. Harrison as the chief of urology and the Elliott Carr Cutler professor of surgery at Harvard. And there in front of me, he dictated letters to Drs. Goodwin and Harrison describing the plan. And here is the letter he sent me. Dear Pat, here's a fascinating letter from Dr. Harrison. I believe that he and you and I should plan your career jointly. In other words, we should give you the best sort of education you can possibly have in clinical urology, with an accent on the application of modern quantitative biological techniques to the problem of urology. And then, if all works out well, as I'm sure it will, both he and I would enjoy bringing you back here as a forward-looking appointment in urology under the wing of the Elliott Carr Cutler professor. A brilliant prospect, and one I know you can fulfill. I had no idea that I was even qualified to go into academic medicine, much less to be a leader. And I had to read that letter many times to absorb the words, a brilliant prospect, and one I know you can fulfill. I did not believe I could do this, but had to trust he was correct and do my best to make it happen. And so over and over in my career, when I saw very talented residents, I would pull them aside and I would say, you are going to be able to do this and you must do it. Because when someone tells you that, you have to believe that what they're saying is true. And you have to do what you can to make it happen. Well, I completed the second year of general surgery at the Brigham and the next year in pediatric surgery at the Boston Children's Hospital. And in July 1967, we moved to Los Angeles. The clinical experience at UCLA with Goodwin and Kaufman was unsurpassed. Urologists did all the kidney transplants. We did thoracoabdominal incisions, surgery for renal vascular hypertension, on and on. But I was concerned about the need to make an important discovery in the laboratory, which I felt would be a prerequisite to justify a professorship at the Brigham. I had no prior experience working in a basic laboratory, and urology had no such facility. So the second year of residency would be spent in the laboratory, so I wrote to Dr. Moore for advice about a topic for research. He wrote back, you should work on the endocrine soil in which prostate cancer grows. A brilliant suggestion. Molecular endocrinology. That was the answer, and the timing was perfect. 4 months after I began the laboratory year, Gene Wilson published his groundbreaking work on the internuclear binding of dihydrotestosterone. And at that time, anti-androgens were new. No one knew how they worked. But the findings in this paper suggested they either blocked the production of dihydrotestosterone or its binding to the receptor. Here was the important project I was looking for. Willard Goodwin agreed to permit me to spend 2 years as a fellow in research endocrinology with Bill O'Dell, Ron Swerdloff, and Stan Kornman at the Harvard General Hospital. And 18 months later, the formatting of this slide is off a little bit. 18 months later, I presented this talk to a plenary session at the American Urological Association, Mechanism of Androgen Action, Effect of Specific Intracellular Inhibitors. This was the first time most urologists learned about the molecular action of androgens. I also worked on other important problems, like the first proof that anti-androgens block the effect of adrenal androgens on prostate cancer growth, and the feedback regulation of gonadotropins in men, effect of estrogen. Planned road back to Boston. 1971 to 1973. After finishing my residency at UCLA, the Vietnam War was still active, and I had to fulfill my military obligation. I was assigned to the Naval Hospital in San Diego, the world's largest military hospital, for 2 years in charge of the officers' clinic, where I had exposure to an operation I had never performed as a resident, radical retropubic prostatectomy. So why hadn't I done that? Well, Dr. Goodwin had trained at Hopkins, where the perineal approach was used, and that's what we did at UCLA. From 1973 to 1974, I had arranged to spend a year as a visiting professor, a visiting assistant professor of medicine, studying fetal endocrinology with the great Gene Wilson in UT Southwestern. And then we had our planned arrival in Boston in 1974. A change in plans. In 1972, Dr. Scott decided to retire as the chair of the Brady Institute, and in February 1973, the position was offered to me. In May 1973, we visited Baltimore. Well, how did I decide what to do? I asked Peg for her advice, and I took it. There was nothing in Baltimore that excited her. But at a dinner on the last night, she saw the dean. Well, listen, we were living in La Jolla, California. I'm sorry. We were headed back to Boston, you know, where she had a job. We have all our friends, you know. So Baltimore was not number 3 on that list, you know. There was nothing in Baltimore that excited her. I'll recite that. But on the dinner, on the last night, what she saw was the dean, Dr. Scott, chairs of basic science departments, and distinguished professors, all sitting around the table, talking like they were family. She turned to me, she said, "Nothing like this would ever happen in Boston." Although she longed to return to Boston, she saw that this opportunity was tailor-made for me, and the collegiality of Hopkins was a unique feature. I accepted the Hopkins job. They agreed to wait for me to come in July 1974. 1973 to 74, Dallas, Texas with Gene Wilson. It was the perfect preparation for my future at the Brady. Mike Brown and Joe Goldstein were down the hall making their Nobel Prize-winning discovery. I saw how a great department of medicine was run, and it was a very productive 12 months. The first description of the 5-alpha reductase deficiency syndrome. The first demonstration of estrogen-androgen synergism in the induction of canine BPH, and the description of the pathogenesis of congenital microphallus. The Brady Institute, 1974. At age 36, I became the 3rd urologist-in-chief and director of the Brady Institute. When I arrived, I found some wonderful opportunities and some challenges. Opportunities. Tradition. Following in the footsteps of Hugh Hampton Young, the founder of modern urology, and William Scott, who pioneered mandatory research as a part of residency training. Discovery, the #1 priority. And I'm going to pause and say, focusing on that was the secret to our success. And you'll see how this spells out later on. I mean, and what was wonderful, That's what I wanted to do, and that's what Hopkins wanted me to do. And you could have gone many places where instead they wanted you to go out to some town and run a little clinic. Donald Coffey, the great scientist, whose primary appointment at that time was in pharmacology. He accepted my offer to become the director of the Brady Research Laboratories, a position he held with great distinction for 30 years. And the nurses, they were fantastic. Challenges, a small faculty. Here's a photograph of the faculty a month before I arrived. Dr. Scott and 2 foreign medical graduates, junior people. That was the faculty. Few patients. Following the Martin Luther King riots in 1968, many patients would not venture into East Baltimore and instead went to Brady urologists at suburban hospitals. So immediately I had to recruit new faculty. And I don't know, well, I guess I do know, from being at Boston Children's, I realized that there was a great opportunity in pediatric urology and we did not have it. So I went out and recruited Bob Jeffs from the Toronto Sick Children's Hospital, where he had the largest pediatric urology unit in North America, to run the new division of pediatric urology. Mike Droller, who you heard this morning, from Stanford to work on the immunology of bladder cancer, and Frey Marshall, who had just finished the Mass General, who was very interested in surgery of the kidney. The Brady building was aging. There is a patient room. There is the laboratory. And there is the ground floor clinic. There are lots of challenges in renovating it. The building was 8 stories high, but built on a tiny footprint. Renovation of the building to accommodate modern inpatient care was impractical. So you can see the length of the building. It was very short because it would only provide for 10 patients on each floor. And because there was no room to expand, it became clear it had to be relocated. So this is the birthplace of modern urology, okay? And my job is I'm going to move it. That was the first mistake Walsh made, but you know that was the cards I was handed. Prostate cancer was a scourge. My major interest was prostate cancer, but at that time, before PSA testing was available, prostate cancer was like pancreatic cancer today. Men did not know they had it until they had symptoms, and by that time, it was often too late to cure. If a man with a new diagnosis at that time did not die from something else over the next 15 years, he had a 50% chance of dying from prostate cancer. And as a young man, I saw 2 of my mother's brothers die from the disease. So why was the mortality so high? Well, I just said that oftentimes it was advanced at the time of diagnosis. But even for patients who had curable disease, they were rarely treated with curative intent. So why was that? Well, radiation therapy was in its infancy and was underpowered. What about surgery? Patients did not want surgery because they felt it was worse than the disease. 100% of men became impotent. 25% of men were left with no urinary control. And urologists did not want to operate because of the frightening bleeding that was oftentimes life-threatening. Much to my surprise and disappointment, this was even true at Hopkins, the institution where radical prostatectomy was first performed 70 years earlier by Hugh Hampton Young. If an operation is difficult, you are not doing it properly. Robert Gross. During my residency at Boston Children's, I saw Robert Gross, a pioneer in pediatric cardiac surgery, perform operations on children with serious congenital heart defects, many of whom died on the table. Despite these discouraging results, he challenged himself with a motto that hung in every operating room. If an operation is difficult, you're not doing it properly. So he told himself, after all those children died on the table, I didn't do that operation properly. This admission left a lasting impression on me. Clearly, radical prostatectomy fell into that category. We were not doing it properly. Well, you know, was it possible to eliminate the side effects? Why not? I had spent the prior 10 years training at excellent centers on both the East and West Coast and never heard anyone suggest it might be possible to reduce the side effects. They were accepted as the price you had to pay for the chance to be cured. No one was working on this problem. As Hugh Young's successor, I felt it was my responsibility to find out what caused these side effects and eliminate them if possible. I began by looking at the anatomy, and that was the answer. These side effects occurred because we did not understand the anatomy surrounding the prostate. There was bleeding because the anatomy of the veins surrounding the prostate had never been charted. What about impotence? Well, everyone agreed it was caused by injury to the nerves that control erections. And because all men were impotent, it was universally believed that these nerves must run through the prostate and that preservation of potency would be impossible. As a matter of fact, when a very famous urologist heard I was working on this, he walked up to me and he said, "Walsh, you have lost your mind." I say that just to tell you that, and I also tell you, for the young people, if something seems impossible, you know, it may not be impossible. You know, so you may be onto something. However, the exact location of the nerves at this time was not known, and there was incontinence because our understanding of the sphincter was incorrect. We didn't know what we didn't know. So here is the diagram in Campbell's Urology, chapter on radical prostatectomy, 1979. That was the anatomy we knew. Here is the anatomy that we learned in 1992. Why didn't we know the anatomy? Because of the use of the adult cadaver. The prostate is shrouded by dense fascia, concealing the surrounding anatomy. After death, the abdominal contents compress the pelvic organs into a thick pancake of tissue, and formalin fixatives dissolve the fatty planes, making the identification of anatomic structures impossible. And what was the solution? Having studied anatomy for 2.5 years in medical school, it seemed obvious to me. Using the operating room as an anatomy laboratory, and eventually dissections in stillborn male infants. The first thing I tackled was bleeding, because this is why surgeons didn't want to operate. Now, you see the venous complex here. It's over the top of the prostate, but it's beneath dense fascia. And because the anatomy was obscure, surgeons believed that excessive bleeding was inevitable. However, using the operating room as an anatomy laboratory, I identified a common trunk over the urethra. And this important observation led to a surgical technique that reduced blood loss. And this bloodless field made it possible to perform a safer, more precise, and thorough cancer operation. How listening to a patient transformed the care of men with prostate cancer. Soon after developing the technique for controlling bleeding, a 58-year-old man returned 3 months following surgery and told me that he was fully potent. Well, I mean, how could that be? If the nerves that control erection ran through the prostate, this should be impossible. However, from this one case, I see Bruce Trock in the room, an N of 1. I knew this was not true. But where were the nerves? The answer was not in any anatomy book, and no one was working on this problem. Here was an opportunity to truly walk alone. At that time, I said a simple prayer, asking the Lord to open my eyes, Now, I think what I was thinking about at that time, just like he opened my eyes to see the veins and solve that problem, but of course, we're talking about something that's not as big as a vein. We're talking about something that's microscopic. But he did open my eyes to see something, and that something was a lonely old man. Peter Donker was his name. He was a neurourologist and professor and chairman of urology at the University of Leiden. In 1977, I was a newly elected member of the American Association of Genitourinary Surgeons and attended my first meeting. The night before the meeting, my wife and I went downtown to a restaurant. And as we were walking to our table, I noticed an older man. So I was 39, he may have been 69, Peg was 37. He was a stranger, but he looked lonely and was standing by himself. Impetuously, for the first and only time in my life, I went up to a total stranger and asked if he was alone, why he was in town, and if he would like to join us for dinner. His name was Peter Donker. He was attending the same meeting. The concierge sent him to the same restaurant. We arrived within minutes of one another. So after a wonderful dinner and conversation, I thought that was the end of it. But no, 4 years later and 4,000 miles away, we met for the second time in Leiden. He was retired, and I was invited by his successor to be a visiting professor. Actually, it was the Borhavi Surgical Symposium, so I was there for 5 days operating and lecturing. So the last day was Friday, February 13th, 1981, my 43rd birthday. Donker volunteered to show me the Windmill Museum, and I asked what he was doing in retirement, and with no premonition of what I would see, I insisted we go there. We went to his laboratory where he was using a dissecting microscope to study the nerves to the bladder in a stillborn male infant. When I asked to see the branches of the nerves responsible for erection, he said he had never looked. 3 hours later, we identified them outside the prostate. So here is my primitive drawing from that day. You can see the red arrow. Some of these fibers appear to go into the corpora cavernosa. The bundle is lateral to the prostate and urethra. And this is the formal drawing we eventually made. You see the prostate, and then you see the pelvic plexus, the branches of the nerves that are along the lateral surface of the rectum, and then you can see the cavernous nerves, the nerves that are responsible for erection, that are clearly outside the prostate. Now, this discovery would never have happened if I had not invited a lonely, older stranger to dinner and had not met him again 4 years later, 4,000 miles away, and had gone to the Windmill Museum and not asked what he was doing in retirement. Well, if you ask Yogi Berra how this happened, he would say it was too much of a coincidence to be coincidental. And Einstein believed that coincidence was God's way of remaining anonymous. But St. John Paul II would say in divine providence, nothing is a coincidence. And that's what I believe. Well, based on this observation, we knew where the cavernous nerves were located in a tiny fetus. But how could we find them, these microscopic structures, in the adult male pelvis? It was like trying to find a defective transistor in your television set. When I returned to Hopkins, once again I used the operating room as an anatomy laboratory. And on October 21st, 1981, in the operating room, I identified some vessels that ran in the same direction as the nerves in the fetus. And based on this observation in the operating room, I speculated that this neurovascular bundle could be used as the intraoperative landmark to identify the microscopic nerves. And on April 26, 1982, armed with that information, I performed the first purposeful nerve-sparing radical prostatectomy. And here is the patient, 25 years later, cancer-free, having lived a normal life. And he went on and lived another 10 years cancer-free. The backstory to the neurovascular bundles. Without the discovery of the neurovascular bundle, this operation would not have been possible. And at that time, I was actually unaware of that term. Well, if you go to the 1985 edition of Gray's Anatomy, it is not there in the index. And if you electronically search the 1,600 pages, the word neurovascular bundle appears only once in the lower leg. So how did I identify it? The answer, my Uncle Harry. My Uncle Harry went to Carnegie Tech and for a few years, and had to return to Akron to run his father's plumbing business. Although he was a plumber by profession, he loved nature and would rather be out in the woods than underneath a sink. When he saw I had the same interests, at age 8, I began taking hikes with him on Sundays, catching turtles and snakes, hunting for fossils and arrowheads. One summer, we went to Canada with a Geiger counter and hunted for uranium. He often taught me big words like superheterodyne. So one Sunday, he taught me the word, the auricular-ventricular bundle of His. Now, don't ask me how he picked that word out of the dictionary. So after these hikes, we would go home where Aunt Anna, my mother's older sister, who was a nurse, would make dinner. That night, I looked in her nurse's dictionary, and I learned that this was the neuromuscular bundle between the auricle and ventricle, the conduction bundle. So from the time I was 8 or 9, I knew that autonomic nerves traveled with adjacent structures. After identifying the nerves in the fetus, I began looking for adjacent structures when operating, and in October 1981, saw the capsular arteries and veins of the prostate and instantly knew they could be the landmark I was looking for. Well, in 1984, I don't know how any of you know who the famous urologic oncologist Willett Whitmore was, but he was Mr. Urologic Oncology. So in 1984, I was invited to go to Stockholm at the Karolinska and to put on a surgical demonstration for 300, I think all the urologists in Scandinavia came, and they had Willett Whitmore as my first assistant. And when he looked down and saw the neurovascular bundles, he said, in doing literally hundreds of radical cystectomies, he had seen them countless times and had not recognized them. You only see what you look for, and you only recognize what you know. Well, during my final years of my residency, sadly and ironically, Uncle Harry developed metastatic prostate cancer and died a painful death with Aunt Anna at his side. But today, if you go to Stedman's Medical Dictionary and you look under B for bundle, in the left-hand column, you will see the atrioventricular bundle of His. And in the right-hand column, you will see the neurovascular bundle of Walsh. Thank you, Uncle Harry. Well, we went on to confirm and expand the anatomy with further anatomic studies. Herb Lepore did this wonderful study looking at the detailed neuroanatomy of the pelvis, confirming the concept of the neurovascular bundle. Peter Schlegel did these repeated fresh cadaveric dissections illustrated by Leon Schlossberg, which gave a very good schematic for the location of the neurovascular bundle and, more importantly, the pelvic plexus in relationship to the seminal vesicle. And then I put together the concept of the fascial planes around the prostate, and we wrote this important paper, like Herb talked about, describing the operative technique. And because of understanding the fascia, which no one had paid attention to, we were able to develop a better cancer operation than was ever done before. April 26, 1982. 8 years after arriving at the Brady, there was a new operation, and on that day, everything changed. Soon there were many patients, the finances were sound, and research was flourishing. The immediate problem, however, was better facilities for patients who started coming from all over the world. Well, however, we had been working on this problem for several years and had identified one of the original buildings built in 1889 as the ideal site for location of the Institute, the Marburg Building. Built in 1889, it was one of 3 remaining original buildings and was on the National Register of Historic Landmarks. Originally the home for private medical and surgical patients, in 1977, those patients moved to the Nelson Building. This appeared to be the ideal site to relocate the Brady Institute. Robert Heisel, president of the hospital, agreed to my request as long as we raised the funds. Dr. Scott raised $2 million. I was able to raise $500,000. Relocating the Brady Institute. Margaret Campbell Walsh. Peg had established her practice in Baltimore as a commercial interior designer, specializing in healthcare facilities. For this reason, she was invited to lead the restoration of the Brady Building in its new location, the historic Marburg Building. She combined innovation and function with an elegance that architects had never seen in hospitals before. And when the Brady Institute opened in 1982, it was unparalleled in hospital design. Think about this. 5 months after the first operation, we had these beautiful facilities for patients from all over the world to come to. Outstanding laboratories. Beautiful inpatient facilities with porches on both ends of the floors, on 2 floors. A library and conference room. Faculty offices. The Brady had a new home. And I continued to listen to my patients. For 29 years, from 1982 to 2011, I spoke to every patient I operated on, 4,569, every 3 months for the first year, and longer if they had not fully recovered, coaching them to recovery and evaluating outcomes. More than 18,000 telephone conversations. And then, each year, I sent every patient a letter inquiring about their status and their PSA, and I personally inputted all that information into the database. I wanted to know how every patient was doing, and it's amazing what they taught me. Changing one thing at a time, 28 major changes over 29 years. And I wrote this article, Perfecting Nerve-Sparing Radical Prostatectomy, Sailing in Uncharted Waters. And here in this table, you can see the date of the change, the patient number, and the description. And like you just heard earlier in a talk, I always told the residents, if you had the privilege to sail in uncharted waters, you had the responsibility to make those charts. And here is the man who made them, Leon Schlossberg, an artist and an anatomist. So just think for a moment. There was all of this new anatomy, all of this new surgical technique that no one knew. But we had Leon Schlossberg to teach urologists around the world with his beautiful illustrations. And I continued to listen to my patients. My goal was to have every patient continent and potent at 3 months. I stopped operating in June 2011, June 29th, I just was reminded at 2011. And I did not reach my goal of having every patient potent and continent at 3 months. But in the 200 operations I performed over the last 2 years, using all of these modifications, I had the best results I ever had. In patients who were fully potent preoperatively, and who underwent at least partial bilateral nerve sparing. At 3 months, 49% of patients were potent, and 18 months, 93% were. 80% were totally dry at 3 months, 95% at 18 months, and in the long run, only 2.5% of patients wore a pad that they changed more than once a day. Far better than I was doing when I set off on this journey. The impact of the operation. By 1997, radical prostatectomy became the most common inpatient operation at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, performing more than 1,000 a year. As a result, tissue in large amounts became available for pathologic, biochemical, and molecular analysis. This information, which was never available before, galvanized research for many departments at Hopkins. And then the Brady was ranked #1 department in urology by U.S. News and World Reports year after year. Cancer control. In 1983, only 7% of men with prostate cancer underwent surgery, and radiotherapy was in its infancy. Essentially, few were being treated with curative intent. However, with the advent of PSA testing in 1990, all of a sudden, there were many patients with curable disease who could be cured. And in 1993, 70% of men in their 50s and 55% of men in their 60s underwent surgery. 100,000 men that year. So now I'm going to show you the change in mortality from all cancers in the U.S. in the next decade, between 1993 and 2003. On the right, you'll see in red the cancers where mortality increased. In the left, in red, you'll see the cancers where mortality decreased, and you will see the greatest decline in mortality from cancer during that decade, a 33% decline, was for prostate cancer. And then, a while later, this very important study from Scandinavia, a randomized trial, randomizing men to either radical prostatectomy or watchful waiting. And patients who underwent surgery experienced a 45% reduction in death from prostate cancer. And the conclusion was that men with clinically detected localized disease and a long life expectancy benefited from radical prostatectomy with a mean of 2.9 years of life gained. I did not do this alone. Here is the faculty between 1974 and 2004. I could spend an hour talking about each one of these individuals and their contributions. And then they were our residents, our strength. Here is a reunion of faculty of residence and faculty of residence from 1974 to 2004. Over the 30 years that I was chair, we recruited 62 residents. 87% went into academic medicine, and 23 went on to chair major academic departments. I started out talking about discovery. So what kinds of discovery happened between 1974 and 2004? Discovery in the operating room, in the clinic and in the laboratory. In the operating room, Robert Jeffson, John Gearhart, functional reconstruction of bladder exstrophy. When I was at Boston Children's, we had these little kids, and they would cut the bladder out, leaving them with an ugly scar in their suprapubic area, and take their ureters and plug them into the colon, subjecting them to a lifetime of urinary tract infections, and subsequently we learned an increase in risk for colon cancer. And along comes Bob Jeffs and John Gearhart, and talk about a difference in lives. I mean, Bob would always say to me, "You're saving your patients' lives for a few years. I'm saving them for a lifetime." I mean, it was overwhelming to see what a quality of life that was, and it was also not just for the child, but for the family. Frey Marshall and Bruce Wright's excision of renal cell carcinoma involving the right atrium, hypothermia, and cardiac arrest. Lou Cavussi and Lloyd Ratner, laparoscopic living donor nephrectomy. That transformed the field of transplantation. All of a sudden, you could give a kidney to a relative without having a great big painful scar and with only a short hospital stay, to the point today that many men and women will give a kidney to someone they don't know. Neuro-sparing radical prostatectomy. In the clinic, Mike Droller, developmental pathways and pathogenesis of bladder cancer. Alan Parton, nomogram for predicting pathologic stage. Charlie Pound, nomogram to predict natural history of biochemical failure after radical prostatectomy. John Epstein and Chaz Brendler, characterization of criteria that are ideal for surveillance only. Bal Carter, active surveillance for low-risk cancers, PSA kinetics to improve diagnosis and prognosis, and the characterization of hereditary prostate cancer. And then in the laboratory, Donald Coffey, the father of modern science in prostate disease, because of the many scientists he personally trained and hundreds of others he influenced. Herb Lepore and Ellen Shapiro, mapping the alpha-1 adrenergic receptors in BPH. Bill Nelson, discovery of glutathione S-transferase, PI, inactivation through methylation, as one of the earliest events in the development of prostate cancer's malignant phenotype. Bud Burnett and Saul Snyder, the role of nitric oxide in erectile function. John Isaacs, translation of basic science theory into clinical trials for lethal prostate cancer. And William Isaac, discovery of the genetic basis of hereditary prostate cancer. And I want to pause and praise Bill, who dedicated his skill, intellect, and energy for the last 3 decades to uncover the genetic pathogenesis of prostate cancer. These discoveries are a tribute to his brilliance and perseverance. Well, thanks to our partners in discovery who provided resources, these advances were possible. Leadership cohorts, the Brady Advisory Board members and special friends, Keith Reinhardt, who's sitting down front, Chris Evanson, Bill and Carolyn Stutt, Ross Myers and Beth, Dean and Mary Nesbitt, George and Mary Nell Berry, Alan and Jeff Hopkins, Mark Murphy, and Mario Duhan. The Founders Circle, discovering tomorrow's leadership donors. Just think what individuals in this room provided funds for, the future of our field. Programs, Fund for Research and Progress in Urology, Prostate Cancer Research Fund, Hereditary Prostate Cancer Program, the Discovery and Learning Laboratory. And during my directorship, many donors who established named professorships, fellowships, and endowed research funds. Today, the value of all of these endowments totals nearly $100 million. Thank you to all who made this possible. And talk about making it possible, our development group, Allison Traub during my time, and Alyssa Cohell and her team today. And again, I want to pause and say, the event, unless it flops tonight, it's going to be the best event I've ever attended. And you have no idea how hard they worked and how hard they worked me. I mean, this isn't easy, but I'm very serious. I mean, I think we should give them a round of applause right now. This is the backbone that made the Brady happen. This picture was taken on June 29th, 2011, after my last operation, and it has the important people who made it happen. Mary Rose Gans, admired and beloved administrator. Barbara Downs, executive secretary par excellence. And Cindy DiFerdinando, unexcelled outpatient executive. Janet Worthington, brilliant science writer and author. This is the first book we wrote 30 years ago, The Prostate, A Guide for Men and the Women Who Love Them. We followed that up in 2001 with 4 editions of Surviving Prostate Cancer from 2001 to 2018. And now the latest edition that just came out last October, the 5th edition, is now, the senior editor is Ted Schaefer. The history of the Brady Institute, and 23 issues of discovery. Peg. Without her, I would not be standing here, and the Brady would not be what it is today. It's easy to recite her many architectural and design achievements, but more difficult to describe her strong character and wisdom. Here is a perfect example. When we came to Baltimore, she wanted to live in the country and I in the city. When I told her we could find a place in the country to go on weekends, she wisely said, "Patrick, you will never have time for that. We need to build a place so that when we are home, we are away." So 3 years later, we built this contemporary house out in the countryside. And not too long thereafter, a second building for her firm. And today, we are one of 3 houses. Thanks to our adjacent neighbors, we are one of three houses on 150 acres. Truly, when we are home, we are away. And the Brady logo, which is inspired by the cupola on the Marburg building with the double-hung windows that spell Brady. And the Brady tie, which many of us have on today, and the colors of the Brady tie, which were also accent colors throughout the building, the red for the brick and the blue-gray for the grouting. And then so many other projects she did. She did the lobby of the first building of Green Springs Station, the Osler textbook room, the Halstead Museum, the Brady Urology Clinic, the beautiful library for the Wilmer Eye Institute, and the Marburg Pavilion. And the mother of our 3 sons seen here with their beautiful wives, and a wonderful grandmother to our 10 grandchildren. The final advice I give to trainees. I give a talk to trainees on how to make important discoveries. And I end with this advice. Even if you follow everything I have said, you will not be successful without the most important ingredient: a partner in life who embraces and inspires your dreams and is willing to accept the sacrifices that will be necessary. I was fortunate to have my wife, Peg, who made those dreams come true. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very nice.